Good day, everyone. I am Shelo Angela Marihuan, and today I am going to continue to discuss that topic that was started by Miss Mitante and Miss Miterde, which is the what are the guidelines in designing performance assessment. So, as you know, our discussion covered two parts. So, for the first part is the discussion about the key questions or guidelines in designing performance assessment, and that was discussed by Miss Mitante and Miss Muterde, and I hope that you have learned something from them. And for the second part, which is my part, is an example that shows how learning outcomes, teaching learning activities, and assessment tasks should be aligned. So without further ado, let's start the part 2 or my part. So, furthermore, the choice of teaching learning outcomes is also of utmost importance in choosing the performance assessment to use. So, there should also be an alignment among the learning outcomes, the teaching learning activities, and assessment tasks. So, this means that the learning outcomes, the teaching learning activities, and the assessment tasks should be clearly aligned. So, to better understand that, let's have an example in a physical education dance class. So the following three course components should be explicitly clear and linked. So as shown below on the table. So here we have the table. So as you can see, this table shows how the course is intentionally designed by clearly linking the three key components. So what are these three key components? So we have the intended learning outcomes, the teaching learning activities, and the performance assessment task. So the idea is that in intended learning outcomes, this is what the students are expected to learn at the end of the course. For the teaching learning activities, this is how the students are taught. And for the performance assessment task, this is how the students are assessed or evaluated. So let's now have the first intended learning outcomes. So just like what I have mentioned earlier, intended learning outcomes is what the students are expected to do at the end of the course. So in this case, the students are expected to perform dance routines and creatively combine variations with rhythm coordination, correct footwork technique, frame facial and body expression. So how will these learning outcomes will be supported inside the classroom? So let's now have the teaching learning activities. Okay. So for developing dance skills, activities like lecture, class discussion, movement exercises, dance demonstration, teacher and partners, and collaborative learning is done. Now, how will this be evaluated, or how will this assessed by the teachers? So let's now have the performance assessment task. So in performance assessment task, this shows how students' learning is evaluated. So technical and creative skills are assessed through culminating dance class recitals, practical tests for each type of dance, reflection papers, peer evaluation rating. So as you can see, the three key components are clearly aligned because the intended or the learning outcomes guide the teaching methods, and the assessment task is clearly measured, or it's directly measured whether the learning outcomes have been achieved. So let's now have the second intended learning outcomes. So the students are also expected to participate in dance, socials, and other community fitness advocacy projects. So how will this be supported inside the classroom, or how will this be taught? So let's now have the teaching learning activities. So for community involvement, required attendance and participation in school and community dance performances ensure that students gain real-world experiences. So in this case, how will be the students' learning is evaluated? So community participation is assessed through actual dance performance in school or community programs, reaction or reflection papers that allow students to articulate their learning experiences. So just like the first intended learning outcomes, the second intended learning outcomes, the second teaching learning activities, and the second performance assessment task is also clearly aligned because the learning outcomes guide the teaching methods, and the assessment task is directly measure whether those outcomes have been achieved. So overall, this table demonstrates constructive alignment because just like what I've said earlier, the learning outcomes guide the teaching methods, and the assessments directly measure whether those outcomes have been achieved. So let's now have the conclusion. So in conclusion, designing performance assessment requires careful planning and alignment. By starting with clear learning outcomes, selecting appropriate and authentic tasks, and using clear criteria and indicators, teachers can now ensure that assessment truly reflects student learning. And wait, okay. When learning outcomes, teaching learning activities, and assessment tasks work together, performance assessment becomes a powerful tool for meaningful and holistic education. Okay, so I think that ends my part, and I also think that that ends our discussion for this topic. So thank you so much, guys, for listening and watching, and I miss you guys all so much. Thank you. Bye bye.